Have you ever witnessed someone being humiliated, only to realize, too late, they were the most powerful person in the room? What would you do if you laughed at a stranger, not knowing the world would soon remember their name? This is the story of a woman who walked into a room full of polished cruelty, dressed in simplicity, wrapped in grace, and was mocked, dismissed, and rejected. But what they didn't know was that her silence was never weakness. It was patience. And when the truth came out, it shattered everything they thought they knew about class, power, and worth. If you've ever judged a book by its cover, brace yourself. This story is your mirror. The music thumped through the walls like a second heartbeat, muffled laughter echoing from the grand living room, where New York's most influential socialites gathered for the annual Blackwell Foundation Winter Gala. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above velvet drapes, golden light pouring onto marble floors that hadn't seen a speck of dust in years. The champagne flowed freely, the designer gowns swayed like petals in the wind, and the air was thick with entitlement. And then there was her, Amara, a beautiful black woman in her early 30s, dressed not in diamonds or silk, but in a simple, elegant navy dress that clung gently to her frame. No flashy accessories, no name-dropping, just quiet grace. She stood near the edge of the room, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching as people air-kissed and traded shallow compliments like currency. She didn't belong, not in their eyes, and she knew it. A group of women nearby, sculpted by personal trainers and Botox, cast sidelong glances in her direction. One of them, Madison, let out a quiet, sharp laugh and whispered just loud enough, "She must be catering staff, or someone's +1 who doesn't know the dress code." The others chuckled in unison. Amara heard it. She always heard it. She turned slowly and gave them a polite nod, the kind that said, "I see you, but I'm not here for you." That only made them smirk harder. "I mean," Madison continued, swirling her drink, "who comes to a Blackwell event looking like that? Minimalist chic, or just minimal?" Amara turned away, her gaze steady, her hands still. She had heard worse, lived through worse. She had come tonight not to impress, but to stand beside the man she loved, even if he was, at the moment, nowhere in sight. "Excuse me," said a young waiter brushing past her, nearly spilling wine on her dress. "Staff are supposed to be in the back." She looked at him, not with anger, but with a deep, bone-weary sadness. "I'm not staff," she said simply. "My apologies," he stammered, retreating with flushed cheeks. But the damage had already been done. Again. Always. From across the room, someone noticed. Not her husband. Not yet. But someone who would soon come to regret every smug assumption they ever made. The clink of glasses rose as the host stepped forward, microphone in hand, his voice oozing charm, polished by generational wealth. "Let's raise a glass to the future of the Blackwell legacy," he said, eyes scanning the crowd. "To Julian Blackwell, a man of vision, power, and impeccable taste." Applause erupted, elegant and restrained, the kind learned in finishing schools and trust fund boardrooms. Amara remained where she was, on the fringe, her glass untouched. A few heads turned, noticing her stillness like a crack in an otherwise perfect painting. One man, older, white, in a three-piece suit and with skin like waxed parchment, leaned toward Madison. "That her?" he asked. "The one they said Julian's been slumming it with?" Madison sipped her drink with a sly smile. "Rumor has it. Honestly, if that's the case, I expected more. Finesse. not some charity case with good bone structure. Amara heard that too. Every syllable is like a needle sliding beneath the skin. But she didn't move. She didn't defend herself. She watched. She listened. She endured. They weren't just mocking a woman. They were mocking a symbol of everything they feared. Difference, disruption, defiance without shouting. A few feet away, an art dealer with a laugh too big for the room bragged about an acquisition. Bought a Basquiat for a steal. Black art is hot right now. Real estate in Harlem's next. More nods, more laughter, more glasses raised. To them, black was only valuable when framed, polished, stripped of its living breath. Amara's hand tightened around her glass. Her lips remained sealed, but her silence was not surrender. She wasn't here to demand space. She had already claimed it. They just hadn't realized it yet. A tap on a crystal flute called for silence. "Julian's on his way," someone said. "He had a last-minute call." The room buzzed. Madison leaned toward the others, her tone syrupy and cruel. "Well, let's hope he doesn't bring the +1 to the stage. It might clash with the chandeliers." They laughed, loud and unbothered. Behind them, Amara took one slow sip of water. She had no need to raise her voice. Soon, the entire room would be silent for her. The string quartet swelled in the corner as servers weaved through the crowd with trays of foie gras and champagne. But the music couldn't drown out the rising whispers. Amara had taken a seat, not at the periphery, not tucked in the shadows, but at a table labeled reserved, squarely in view of the chandelier's center light. It wasn't bold. It was quiet, certain, like someone claiming a place already earned. But to the others, it was a problem, a disruption in their curated aesthetic. Madison approached first, her smile carved from porcelain and poison. "Hi there," she said, crouching slightly as if speaking to someone's child or an errant staff member. "I think this seat might be taken. Those are for the family." Amara looked up, calm and unmoved. "I know." Her tone held no apology, no room for correction, just the truth, spoken plainly. "Right," Madison said, glancing around as if for backup. "But maybe there's been some confusion." A man with graying temples stepped in next. "Miss, this section is managed," Amara cut in, folding her napkin gently. "And I was told to sit here." That wasn't entirely false. Julian had whispered it to her that morning, pulling her close. "They might not be ready, but I am. Let them see." But the crowd didn't know that. They only saw a woman who didn't match the tablecloths. The murmurs grew louder. An older white woman clutched her pearls, literally, and muttered, "This is why you don't just let anyone in, no matter how pretty." A man in a sleek black tuxedo, who had never spoken a word to Amara, motioned to security. Two guards appeared from the edges of the room, their presence subtle but unmistakable. "Ma'am," one said, voice low but firm, "we're going to have to ask you to step aside. We've had some concerns from guests." Amara stood slowly, the way a tide rises, not rushed, but inevitable. She looked at the guard, then at the crowd, then back at her untouched plate. "Of course," she said, "but just so we're clear, I was invited. You just didn't know who by." She stepped away, her dress catching the light, her silence heavier than the buzz now coursing through the room. Guests turned to each other like anxious schoolchildren caught in a lie. Who was she? Who invited her? And more importantly, what if they had just made a mistake they couldn't afford to unmake? Amara stood by the grand staircase, her posture regal, though she was framed in shadows, far from the laughter and champagne. The ambient clinking of glasses, the synthetic small talk, the silk and diamonds. They had all returned to their rhythm, as if her presence had never stirred the waters. But beneath the polished surface, ripples lingered. From across the ballroom, she could feel the eyes still on her, some curious, others hostile. Madison, now flushed with victory, strutted past with a flute of sparkling wine, tossing a smug glance over her shoulder. "Well," she whispered to her friend. "Crisis averted. Can't just let the help take a seat at the king's table." Her voice wasn't loud, but it wasn't meant to be secret either. Amara heard it. Everyone near her did. And still, she didn't move. Not to respond, not to react. Instead, she simply smoothed her dress, fingers brushing the soft fabric, and turned to walk toward the exit. Elegant, unhurried, proud. She didn't belong in their vision of this evening, not because she lacked beauty or grace or poise, but because she challenged it. Her presence made their curated world feel flimsy. It made the illusion crack. A photographer had been capturing candid shots near the bar. Now, his lens followed her as she moved through the golden light, like a painting in motion. One frame, then another. There was something magnetic about her stillness within the noise, something timeless. As Amara reached the front foyer, one of the servers, young, black, wide-eyed, stepped into her path. He looked embarrassed to say anything, but he spoke anyway. "Miss, I just wanted to say, I saw what happened in there, and the way you carried yourself. It meant something." She paused, meeting his gaze gently. "Thank you," she said, and touched his wrist briefly, a silent affirmation. Then she turned toward the doors. No theatrics, no collapse, just a quiet exit in front of people who didn't deserve to watch her leave. But the room would remember. Maybe not her name, not yet, but her presence. That would haunt them longer than any wine or waltz. Because in a night built to celebrate power, the most powerful thing they saw was the woman they had pushed aside. Outside, the night was cooler than expected, the sky velvet black and heavy with silence. Amara stood beneath the porte-cochere, the soft hum of luxury engines, and the valet's shuffling movements the only soundtrack. She folded her arms, not out of cold, but to steady her rising pulse. She wasn't hurt. No, she was beyond that. She was calculating, deciding how much to reveal, and how soon. Then, from a distance, came the familiar purr of an engine she knew like her own heartbeat. The crowd inside was still laughing, still clinking glasses over crystal platters of caviar, when a matte black Rolls-Royce Phantom slid into the driveway. It moved with the quiet authority of something or someone who never needed to rush. The valets stood straighter. Even the security team adjusted its stance. The driver stepped out quickly, opening the back door, and Julian Blackwell emerged. Tailored in midnight blue Tom Ford, his presence was immediate, towering, electric. His face, sharply cut, unreadable, was the kind only money and legacy could carve. But his eyes, they searched for one thing only: Amara. And when they found her, the tension in his frame eased, only slightly. He walked to her without a word, his hand sliding gently onto the small of her back, like it belonged there. And it did. Inside, someone gasped. One of the security guards, now suddenly flustered, lifted a hand to his earpiece. "Mr. Blackwell just arrived," he whispered to someone on the other end. "And he's with the woman we asked to leave." In the ballroom, the energy shifted. News always travels fast in rooms full of people pretending not to listen. Madison's laugh froze in midair. The chatter softened. One of the hedge fund managers near the bar, nearly choked on his scotch. Julian Blackwell, here. But he wasn't supposed to show until the keynote tomorrow night. Back outside, Julian finally spoke, his voice low, velvet, and razor-edged. They turned you away? Amara didn't respond. She didn't need to. He could see it in her eyes. He took a slow breath, like a man suppressing the kind of anger only kings are taught to hide. Then he turned toward the entrance. Come, he said simply, not as a request, but as a promise. And with that, they stepped forward, back into the house that had dismissed her. This time, side by side, a billionaire and the woman they thought they could erase. The whispers began before they even crossed the threshold. The air tightened. Some people rose from their seats. Others suddenly remembered her face. That dress, that grace. That woman they'd looked down on an hour ago, now standing beside the most powerful man in the room. And not just beside him. Belonging. As Julian and Amara entered the grand ballroom, the laughter ceased like a record scratched mid-song. Conversations stalled. Forks hovered mid-air. Madison froze at the center of her group, her champagne flute slipping slightly in her hand. Julian's presence was a ripple-turned tidal wave. One glance from him silenced even the most arrogant mouths in the room. But it wasn't just his wealth. It was how he looked at Amara. Protective, proud, and most of all, equal. They moved together with quiet power, past the guests who had mocked, dismissed, or ignored her. Julian's expression didn't flinch, but his presence was sharper than a blade. One man attempted a nervous chuckle. Julian, I didn't know you. Julian didn't stop walking. Save it. His tone was calm, but final. That man shrank. Madison recovered just enough composure to step forward, plastering on a smile that crumbled around the edges. Julian, darling. We didn't realize she was... Julian's gaze snapped to her, pinning her in place like a hawk. You didn't realize she was human. His voice was a scalpel, quiet, precise, deadly. Madison flinched, lips parting, but no sound came out. The guests around her retreated in small, cowardly steps. Julian turned slightly to the crowd, scanning each face with a precision that stripped every smug grin, every tight-lipped smirk, of its arrogance. This is Amara, he said, his voice like cold steel against velvet walls. My wife. The woman who stood beside me when I had nothing, and who, unlike many of you, has never needed to tear anyone down to feel tall. The room pulsed with embarrassment. A few people looked at their feet. Others turned away, pretending to suddenly need fresh air. Only a few held Julian's gaze, and none of them proudly. Amara stood quiet, her chin slightly lifted, her dignity intact. She hadn't said a word. She didn't need to. The silence around her was louder than any apology could ever be. Julian looked at her then, and something softened in his face. Not weakness, reverence. Let's go, he said gently, not because he was leaving in shame, but because this room no longer deserved her presence. As they turned to walk out, someone called after them. Soft, hesitant. Wait, Amara, I'm sorry, came a voice from near the dessert table. It was Madison's assistant, the only person who had met Amara's eyes earlier that night, with anything close to kindness. Amara paused, glanced back, and nodded once, gracious, but firm. Then she walked forward with Julian beside her, leaving behind a room full of people now choking on the bitterness of their own reflection. The video was only 30 seconds long, a shaky, over-the-shoulder shot taken on someone's phone. It captured the silence that fell when Julian Blackwell walked into the ballroom, Amara beside him like the calm in a storm. It caught Madison's panicked expression, Julian's cutting words, and most of all, it caught Amara, standing tall, silent, radiant in the fire of humiliation, turned grace. Within hours, it was everywhere. By morning, it had gone viral. No context needed, no headlines required, just the raw truth of a moment when power was realigned in silence. Her name is Amara. Dignity looks like this. Black excellence. These weren't just hashtags. They were signals. A call to every person who had ever been dismissed, laughed at, or made invisible. People across the country reposted the clip with their own stories. Black women in boardrooms, classrooms, and hospitals, sharing the moments they had been overlooked and the strength they had carried anyway. Comment sections turned into confessionals, then into battle cries. And somewhere in Chicago, a high school art teacher named Raven scrolled through the video on her lunch break. Her hands trembled as she watched it again, and again, and again. She had nearly resigned that week, tired of being passed over, talked down to, and ignored by administrators and parents alike. But then she saw Amara, saw that quiet defiance, saw herself. The next day, Raven didn't resign. She marched into her principal's office and demanded the budget they had denied her for 3 years. "You're not invisible," she told her students later that afternoon. "You're not small. They just don't know how to see you yet." Amara never meant to start anything. But somehow, without speaking, she had cracked open a dam. And dignity, long silenced, was rushing in. Across living rooms and boardrooms, hair salons and subway cars, her name was on the lips of those who finally felt seen. And back in New York, as Amara sat on her terrace with Julian's coat wrapped around her shoulders, sipping tea in the early morning light, she scrolled through her phone. Message after message, from women like Raven, from little girls who had seen the video and pointed at the screen. "She looks like me." She turned the screen toward Julian. "I didn't ask for this." "No," he said, smiling. "But maybe the world needed you to be seen." And Amara, for the first time since that night, allowed herself to cry. Not from pain, but from the strange, quiet power of being witnessed. The gala committee released a one-line statement. "We regret the misunderstanding." It was cold, hollow, and buried beneath a heap of bad PR. But no apology could undo what had been broadcast to millions. Madison Clark went dark on all platforms. Her name dragged through every outlet from Vogue to local radio shows. Sponsors quietly pulled their funding from the organization she co-chaired. Her colleagues began to distance themselves. And behind closed doors, her law firm debated whether she was now more liability than asset. Julian didn't touch any of it. He didn't need to. The storm moved on its own. Instead, he focused on something else, restoring what was quietly, painfully taken from Amara that night. Not her dignity, but her space, her belonging, her voice. He arranged a private gallery event in Manhattan. No red carpet, no photographers, no whispered comparisons to who wore it better. Just art, just space. And a quiet invitation list of curators, artists, and collectors who actually understood what it meant to see beyond prestige. Amara didn't want to go. She said it felt like a fight spectacle with another. But Julian simply said, "This time, it's your room, and you walk in first." So she came, wearing the same dress, hair down, no designer name, just Amara. And when the doors opened, the room didn't gasp. They stood, in reverence, not shock. Because this wasn't a reaction to a headline. It was a welcome. At the center of the gallery, under a soft wash of gold light, hung one of Amara's paintings. A woman is standing in the middle of a storm, not shielding herself, not bending, just standing. Head high, eyes forward, every brushstroke a defiant whisper. I am still here. An older man approached her. You're the artist? He asked, gently. Amara hesitated, then nodded. I've never seen grief look so still, he said, staring at the canvas. You've given it a spine. And in that moment, Amara felt something shift. Not in the world, but in herself. The weight of silence was no longer hers to carry. As the night wore on, conversations buzzed. Not about Julian, not about the scandal, not even about the video, but about her art, her eye, her voice. Camille, the gallery owner, leaned in and whispered, I'd like to offer you a solo show. Whatever you want, whenever you're ready. Amara didn't answer right away. She walked back to her painting, looked at it again. At the storm, at the woman, at everything that had come before. And she smiled. Not because she had arrived, but because she'd never left. Amara didn't plan to inspire anyone. She didn't post long captions. She didn't preach. She didn't protest with banners or shout into microphones. She just existed, gracefully, unapologetically, in a world that had tried to fold her into silence. But somehow, that was the revolution. The video of Julian's intervention didn't fade. It multiplied, shared across continents, languages, timelines. Commentators argued about class and race, about the double standards wrapped in velvet dress codes. But the story that people remembered wasn't his. It was hers. The woman who had been mocked to her face turned away from a stage she had every right to stand on, and yet had stood taller than anyone in that room. Late one night, Amara received a message from someone named Janelle Hardy, a high school art teacher in Detroit. The email was short. Your name came up in my classroom today. My kids don't usually care about anything beyond TikTok, but they watched that video. They saw the way you didn't flinch, and now they want to paint women who look like you. Women who look like us. Thank you. Attached were 10 photos of student art. Full, rich portraits of black women in color, in shadow, in firelight, in quiet. Some regal, some weary, all fierce. The last one was unmistakably Amara. Head turned slightly, mouth closed, gaze level, like she had a secret that no storm could steal. And the story didn't end there. News outlets began referring to her moment as the Amara effect, a ripple of reckoning inside elite social circles. Invitations were being rewritten, dress codes revisited. Foundation boards, event panels, and museum leadership began hearing one persistent, necessary question from new voices. Do we belong here too? Julian's staff began fielding requests for Amara to speak. Ivy League universities, cultural forums, art festivals. She turned most of them down. She didn't want to become a symbol. She was too tired of people dissecting black womanhood like it was an idea instead of a life. But one morning, after rereading Janelle's message, she said yes to a podcast, hosted by a young black woman named Kira, barely 25, running her show out of a Harlem studio with peeling wallpaper and dreams louder than her budget. I'm not an activist, Amara said during the interview, voice soft. I'm not trying to change the world. Kira smiled through her headphones. You don't have to. Just showing up made some of us feel like we could. Amara blinked, stunned and quiet, then nodded, almost to herself. And somewhere in a classroom in Detroit, a girl named Raina clicked play on that very episode, listened once, then again, then opened a blank canvas on her desk and began to draw, not Amara's face, but her own. Bold, sharp lines, no eraser, no fear. The nation didn't just listen, it looked. Years passed, but the name Amara Cole never disappeared. It wasn't just etched in headlines or gallery plaques. It was whispered in classrooms, stitched into murals, quoted in commencement speeches, and spoken softly between strangers who found courage through her story. Her presence had cracked something open, not by shouting over the world, but by refusing to shrink beneath it. What she left behind wasn't a brand or a building. It was something harder to measure. The quiet erosion of shame. The soft permission for people who looked like her, sounded like her, walked into rooms like she did, to take up space without apology. No more tugging sleeves to appear smaller. No more adjusting their hair for comfort's sake. Black girls stopped saying sorry for being brilliant. Black boys started asking questions out loud. Executives began hiring not just diversity officers, but also listening rooms. And then came the story that made it all feel full circle. In a boutique cafe in Charleston, a young white woman named Emily whispered a joke to her friends about a black family seated nearby. Something cruel and tired and far too familiar. She laughed louder than she should have. But this time, the laughter didn't echo. The table next to hers went still. A server paused mid-pour. A couple near the door slowly turned their heads. A man in his late 30s, white, wearing a crisp blue suit, stepped forward. He had been clearing his plate, but now stood tall. "Excuse me," he said, not unkind, but clear. "That wasn't funny. We don't do that here anymore." Emily stammered. "It was just a joke." The man didn't raise his voice. "Then it was a bad one, and you owe them an apology." The cafe stayed silent as she muttered one, and as she left, cheeks burning, she passed a painting on the wall. Amara Cole, in oil and gold, looking directly at the viewer, like she had been watching all along. That was her legacy. Not revenge, not fame, but a shift so deep, even the air in the room had learned to respect itself. In New York, a little girl named Aria wore her curls wild and proud because she'd once seen Amara do the same on the cover of a magazine. In New Orleans, a chef opened a restaurant and named every dish after women who never apologized for walking in the room. In Seattle, a fashion house launched a new line of luxury, rooted in dignity instead of distance. And the first model they booked was a soft-spoken girl with deep brown skin and a gap-toothed smile. Julian still held Amara's hand every night. He never spoke publicly again about that fateful evening, never gave interviews, never needed to. Her voice had said everything that mattered. And somewhere, in a quiet garden outside their home, Amara watched the sunset with a soft smile, grateful that she didn't have to burn the world down to change it. She just had to stand in it, whole, visible, unbent. And because of her, millions now knew. Dignity is not something you earn. It is something you defend. Years from now, they won't remember the clothes she wore or the insults she endured. What they'll remember is the way she stood still while the world tried to shrink her. How she refused to shrink back. She taught an entire generation that elegance has nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with how you carry your truth. They'll remember how a woman like Amara didn't just survive the storm. She made the storm pause to listen. And perhaps the most beautiful revenge of all is that those who once laughed now look to her for guidance, and those who once stayed silent now speak her name with reverence. She didn't fight to be accepted. She fought so no one else would have to be. And that, in the end, is the legacy that outlives us all.